Well, we are up to Mark chapter 14, verses 1 to 16, and our verse-by-verse study through the Gospel of Mark. We know at this point we've come to the final week of Jesus' life. He's only days away of dying by way of crucifixion, and we know that his crucifixion wasn't just a random death, but upon himself he would be taking the punishment for all of our sins. Now, Jesus has just finished taking an extended period of time to instruct his disciples on the subject of eschatology. We know it's the final week of his life, and he's just taken Mark chapter 13, to give an extended discourse, an extended time to explain what it is that is going to take place at a future time leading up to his second coming. And so, having explained to them what's going to happen leading up to his second coming, well, that brings us to today's passage. And what we see in today's passage is that there are still things that must still be accomplished as part of his first coming. Chapter 13, what's going to take place before his second coming? Chapter 14 onward, things that must still be accomplished as part of his first coming. In fact, the most important task of Jesus' first coming was still needing to be completed. And that is none other than his sacrificial, atoning death upon the cross. After all, this is the primary reason for why Jesus had came to earth in the first place. Jesus didn't come to earth to show us a good example of how it is to live, not just a good example of how to live. He didn't just come to earth so he could instruct us about truths of things that we need to know. Jesus didn't just come to earth to merely dazzle us with his supernatural miracles. But as we know, the primary reason for why Jesus came to earth is so that he could essentially fulfill the critical rescue mission. He came to rescue us from both the penalty of sin, but also the power of sin, both of which he accomplished when he took upon himself all the judgment that our sin deserves. He accomplished it when he willingly and he voluntarily laid down his life in our place. We deserved God's hell punishment for our sin, but as we know, Jesus took that upon himself. And so that's why, right at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, his public earthly ministry, when John the Baptist saw Jesus walk by, John the Baptist didn't say, "Hey, look, there's Jesus, a good example to follow." He didn't say, "There's Jesus, someone, a wise instructor who will teach you things that you need to know." Nor did he say, "Hey, there's Jesus, the miracle worker." But instead, John the Baptist looked straight at Jesus and he says, "There's Jesus. He is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." Well, Jesus put it himself this way in Mark chapter 10, verse 45. We saw a few chapters back. He said, "For even as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many." That is the reason why he came, to give his life. And so it's with this in mind, we're going to see in today's passage that the stage is beginning to be set. The stage is beginning to be set for this monumental rescue mission of Christ, which the whole purpose for why he has come to earth in the first place, well, it is all starting to come together. The stage is being set. The pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are all being fitted together for this moment in time which God has preordained, Christ's rescue mission to earth. And the way that we're going to approach today's study is really by looking at the various participants. There are various participants that are involved in today's passage and setting the stage for this time, this point in time in history where Jesus would come and give his life for a ransom for many. And so what we're going to see is that there are actually 5 active participants involved. 5 active participants involved in today's passage leading up to the death of Jesus Christ. Well, who are they? Well, firstly, we're going to see in verse 1, there's the Father. Secondly, in verses 1 and 2, the foes. Thirdly, in verses 3 to 9, the friends. Fourthly, in verses 10 to 11, we're going to see the false disciple. And then finally, in verses 12 to 16, the followers. The Father, the foes, the friends, the false disciple, and the followers. Now, although there are various participants involved in the setting of the stage, something else that we're going to see right throughout the passage today is really the sovereignty of God. That's going to be a theme, a thread that we're going to be able to see as we go through today's passage. In other words, what is taking place in this final week of Jesus' life, it's not just all happening by chance. And it's not just all happening by coincidence. Wow, look at what's happening. But instead, what we're going to see is that every single step along the way is carefully calculated. Every single step along the way is preordained according to the plans and the purposes of God himself. And so let's begin, first of all, by looking at verse 1, where we can identify the first participant in this setting of the stage of this monumental event leading up to the death of Jesus Christ upon the cross. So let's take a look at the very first participant leading up to Jesus' crucifixion, and that is none other than the Father, God the Father. Notice in your Bibles, verse 1. It says, after 2 days, it was the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Let's just stop there for a little bit. Now, at this point, you may be thinking to yourself, hang on a minute, Jason, your outline seems a little bit out of sorts here at the moment. I don't see any mention of God the Father in this verse. And, strictly speaking, that is correct. But the way that we do see God the Father in this verse is the timing of the events that are given here. Because there's certain timing, right? He says after 2 days, it was the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You see, it's not just by random chance that the death of Jesus coincided with this particular Passover and this particular Feast of Unleavened Bread upon this particular year. It's just not by random coincidence. I mean, if we think back to the prophecy given back in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27, a passage of scripture that we looked at quite a bit of detail a couple of months ago, well, you might remember that God gave a specific time frame in which the Jewish temple would be rebuilt and when Messiah the Prince would come onto the scene. Specific time frame. You know, he gave a time frame in that prophecy. And he says that when the Messiah the Prince would come and when the temple would be built. And of course, Messiah the Prince is referring to Jesus. And sure enough, according to the timing given in Daniel chapter 9, right to the very year, right to the very moment, Jesus entered into Jerusalem on the colt of a donkey, hailed as the promised Messiah. It happened just the way that God said it would, back in Daniel chapter 9. But then straight after he was hailed as Messiah, as he was walking into Jerusalem on that particular day, straight after that prediction, the timing of the time of Messiah's coming, we know from Daniel chapter 9 that it says that the Messiah would then be cut off, meaning that he would die, but that he wouldn't just die for himself, which of course he's meaning he's going to be dying for others. And so in this very first verse of chapter 14, what we're reminded of here is that God the Father is clearly at work in setting the stage of the death of Jesus Christ. God the Father is the divine director who is sovereignly orchestrating all these things together behind the scene. Now, the Passover that's mentioned, we know that that was one of the annual celebrations of the Jews. It was a time that was remembered by the Jews, and remembered as the Jews escaped from Egypt before the angel of death passed over them. It was a time they remembered that specific night before they left Egypt, where the angel of death passed over the houses of the Israelites, those who had killed the lamb, and with the blood of the lamb had wiped the blood upon their doorposts, and therefore they were spared of the judgment that passed, the judgment of God passed over them on that particular night. And so that was the feast of the Passover. It was remembering God's deliverance way back in the days of their deliverance from Egypt. Then, of course, we see here that the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that's mentioned there as well. And this also was an annual event. In fact, it lasted for a week long. It was a week-long event, and it started straight after the Passover celebration. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was a time that the Jews remembered their quick departure from Egypt. Right back in the book of Exodus, they had to go. They had to go very, very quickly. And they couldn't take with them any bread that was raised. You know, there's no yeast in there. It was flat bread. And so they had to just rush. They were out the door very, very quickly. And so this is where this idea of the Feast of Unleavened Bread came from, and an annual celebration among the Jews. Again, everything that was taking place at this point leading up to Jesus' Passion Week, all these things are not just happening by random chance, but instead, all that is happening, including the timing, this particular Passover, this particular Feast of Unleavened Bread, it was all taking place, all in line with the Father's design. We see here that the Father is very involved. God the Father is very, very involved in bringing about his plan of redemption. And Jesus knew this. Jesus being God the Son, he knew this all too well, that he was very involved. And he reminded his disciples of this often, of God's sovereignty, of his own sovereignty in terms of bringing about the design of redemption. You see, there were many times throughout Jesus' 3 years of ministry where his enemies and those who opposed him would try to kill him. Many times they tried to take his life. It was just at the very end that it actually happened. But think of the many times that they tried to take his life. Think of, even at Jesus' birth. Think about King Herod. The time when he ordered for every newborn Jewish male to be killed in an attempt to try to eliminate him as Messiah. But none of those attempts succeeded. Why didn't any of those attempts succeed? Because the people weren't skilled enough? No, it wasn't that. But instead, those attempts to take Jesus' life prematurely, they didn't succeed because they were not in line with the Father's will. Well, what this tells us is that Jesus just wasn't a victim of circumstance. When he was arrested, when he was crucified, when he was executed, this was not just an unfortunate turn of events that God the Father somehow used to bring about some good from. But instead, everything that was about to take place was like pieces in a jigsaw puzzle. Everything was being fitted together perfectly, so that in doing so, God was beginning to reveal his plan to mankind. He was starting to show them a picture. Now that the jigsaw puzzle was now coming together, he was showing them his picture of the plan of salvation. Jesus knew this well. He said in John chapter 10, verses 17 and 18, he said earlier to his disciples, "Therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it again." And then he says in verse 18, "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down myself. I have the power to lay it down, I have the power to take it again. This command I have received from my Father." Again, Jesus knew he was not just a victim of circumstance, but instead he was willingly and voluntarily laying down his life. But he wouldn't do so according to the timetable of man. He would only do so according to the timetable of the Father. The Apostle Peter, he puts it like this in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 18 to 20. He says, "Knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things, like silver or gold, from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as a lamb without blemish and without spot. He indeed was ordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you." What a reminder to us that God's plan of salvation and redemption, it was foreordained, it was pre-planned, and it happened even before the creation of the world. I don't know about you, but I think there's something very comforting about this. There's something very reassuring about this truth of who God is. Because think about it. If God is able to handle and control a major world event, the greatest event that has ever been seen, like the atoning sacrifice of Christ, well, how much more can he handle the issues that are happening in our own lives right now? I don't want to trivialize the challenges that we may be going through right now, but think about it. Is there anything happening in our lives right now? And is there any big thing happening in our lives, any challenge, anything that we're struggling with right now that is bigger than the Son of God going to the cross? If God can handle all the details well ahead of time and execute them just rightly in that situation, he can certainly take care of the challenges that we are facing in our own day-to-day lives right now. Something very encouraging, something very comforting about the truth of the sovereignty of God. Well, moving on from the Father in verse 1, we come secondly to the foes, also verses 1 and 2. Notice in your Bibles there, it says, "And the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might take him by trickery and put him to death. But they said, 'Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar of the people.'" And so what we're seeing here is that on a divine level, the Father was sovereignly working behind the scenes. He was putting all things together to accomplish his rescue mission through Jesus' death. And as we know, God the Father, his motive for doing so, he was motivated with love for us. He was motivated by mercy toward us. He was motivated by kindness for us as well. That was on a divine level. But on a human level, we see those who were orchestrating Jesus' crucifixion, they were motivated by pride. Those who are orchestrating his crucifixion on a human level were motivated by envy and by stubborn belief. While Jesus is there in Mark chapter 13 explaining the wondrous things that will be taking place up to his second coming, leading up to his second coming and the glorious second coming of Christ, well, as he's explaining those things, the religious leaders were there together plotting the murder of Jesus. Jesus is talking about how he will come again in splendor, and here you have a group of religious guys saying, how can we murder that guy? I mean, how sad is that? There they are, meeting together. So guys, what's on the agenda today? Well, we're going to see how we can try to murder the Son of God today. I mean, what a sad agenda is that? Well, this is the agenda. But this wasn't the first time that the religious leaders in that day met together to try to plot the murder of Jesus. A bit earlier on, just after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, well, the details of this are given in John chapter 11, verses 47 to 42. It says, then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, what shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation. And one of them, Caiaphas, being the high priest in that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish. Now, this he did not say on his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. You see, the religious leaders were worried about Jesus' growing popularity. I mean, if Jesus hadn't been popular, if he hadn't attracted the attention of so many, well then, they probably would have just let him alone, just another nut, with a couple of ideas over there. But they were very worried about his growing popularity. They thought that Jesus' popularity may cause the people to begin a revolt. They may cause them to begin a rebellion against the Romans. And if the people rebelled against the Romans, well, the Romans, they knew, would respond with military force as they did at any insurrection at any other time. And that the religious leaders, they didn't want that. They didn't want to be an uprising among the Jews against the Romans simply because those religious Jews would lose their privileged positions of authority. And they didn't want that. Because as we've seen in previous studies of Mark, we've seen here that the religious leaders were making an absolute financial killing from their corrupt dealings within the Jewish temple at that time, which, by the way, they had complete control over. It was their jurisdiction, and so they wanted to hold on to that. But not only that, the religious leaders were furious by the fact that Jesus made them look like fools time and time again. Every time they came to question him, well, they would walk away looking like fools. Now, because of his popularity, and because the religious leaders knew that they would receive a lot of opposition if they went to go and arrest Jesus and try to murder Jesus at that time of the Passover, well, they decided, hey, let's try to delay this thing. Let's plan it out, but let's try to delay it. After all, Jerusalem would attract thousands upon thousands of pilgrims who would do a pilgrimage to Jerusalem at the time of the Passover. It was just something that happened every year. The population of Jerusalem would just swell, even to like hundreds of thousands of people coming through Jerusalem, coming to the temple, coming to give tribute at that particular time. And so it's because of all these extra visitors, because of the growing popularity of Jesus, well, then the religious leaders think to themselves, hey, we've got to delay this a little bit, otherwise it's going to come back on us. I mean, many of those people who were visiting at that time, they were the same ones who were hailing Jesus as the Messiah. You just putting palm branches down for him to walk over just several days prior to this. And so the plan of the religious leaders seems to be, let's seize Jesus in secret, and let's wait before murdering him until after the feast, once all those thousands or hundreds of thousands of pilgrims have returned back home again. So, from the religious leaders' perspective, the Passover was the very worst time to try to murder Jesus. Think about the most popular guy, and then trying to execute the most popular guy at the most populated time. It was just a no-go. You don't have to be the sharpest tool in the shed to realise this is not a good time to do this. Yeah, it was the most riskiest time to murder Jesus because of the potential pushback that would come against the religious leaders at that time. But here's the funny thing. Although they, as we see from the text here, although they desperately wanted for things to be delayed, their evil schemes, they couldn't postpone God's timing. They desperately wanted any other time to do this, any other time to murder Jesus. Well, Caesar maybe beforehand, let's keep it quiet for a little while. But the very, very worst time would have been then. And although they tried desperately to delay things, their evil schemes couldn't postpone the timing that God had sovereignly preordained. When the religious leaders finally did achieve their goal of having Jesus crucified, when did it happen? It happened at the time, right in the middle, that they desperately wanted to avoid. I mean, how funny is that? They're saying it right in the text in verses 1 and 2. They want to delay it. They want to sort of come in the back door in terms of their plans. But they couldn't do it. It happened at the time that they desperately wanted to avoid. Now you have to admit, how funny is that? And so clearly their plans were overruled by the sovereign plans of God. Let's put this way in Proverbs chapter 19, verse 21. Really clearly. It says, there are many plans in a man's heart. Nevertheless, the Lord's counsel, that will stand. And that's what these foes of Jesus experienced firsthand. When you think about it, what a comforting truth this is for us, isn't it? As children of God, when we are earnestly seeking God's direction for our lives, we can rest in the fact that we're not going to go heading down a path that God hasn't already prepared for us. As children of God, when we're earnestly seeking God's will, we can rest assured that we're not going to go down a path that God has not already planned for us. This doesn't mean that it gives us an excuse to be reckless. This is not a truth that gives us an excuse to follow our flesh, but it is a truth that can reassure us to step out in faith. It's a truth that can step out in faith in the area in which we sense that God might be leading us at a particular time. Knowing that God is faithful to redirect our paths if somehow we're not kind of hearing Him right. I mean, you only have to cross-reference in your thinking passages such as Acts chapter 16, where you see the Apostle Paul launching out on his second missionary journey. The Apostle Paul had a heart to serve God. The Apostle Paul had a heart to see the gospel go forth. Yet what happens in Acts chapter 16? Door after door closed. Wherever he went to try with a heart to serve God, with a motivation to see the gospel go forth, everywhere he went, the door closed on him. And once more, the text in Acts chapter 16 said it was God who closed those doors. Yet, through a series of disappointments, through a series of dead ends, you might want to call it, God did, in fact, faithfully lead Paul exactly to where he wanted him to be, which demonstrates to us how very active God is within our lives. It demonstrates to us that God is not just a distant God. God is not just an impersonal God, but God is a God who's very, very close to His own. He is very, very close. He's very, very involved. Verses 1 and 2 we see here, it also serves as a reminder to us that the enemies of the gospel who come against us, they do not have freedom to do whatever they desire. That's what verses 1 and 2 remind us of as well. They don't have, those who come against us, enemies of the gospel, they do not have freedom to do whatever it is that they desire. But instead, their opposition against us is sovereignly limited by the will of God. Again, what a reassuring truth to be reminded of as we face the opposition in our own lives for the sake of the gospel. Here these guys are, trying to make their plans, trying to time things the way that they want it to go, but what does God do? He sovereignly limits their intentions by His will. What an encouraging truth for us to remember as well. Well, moving on from the foes, verses 1 and 2, we come next to the friends. And this is found in verses 3 to 9. So let's give our attention, beginning in verse 3. It says, and being in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came, having an alabaster flask of very costly oil of spikenard. Then she broke the flask and poured it on his head. But there were some who were indignant among themselves and said, why was this fragrant oil wasted? for it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they criticized her sharply. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, and whenever you wish, you may do them good. But me you do not have always. She has done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. Assuredly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her." Now, the first thing to understand about this portion here in verses 3 to 9 is that this event here actually took place about 4 days prior to the situation here right now in Jerusalem. And we know this because of the mention of the place called Bethany. That's where Jesus was 4 days prior. And so what Mark does here is that he gets to verses 3 to 9, and what he does is he writes about it. It's a bit of a flashback here. He's talking about something which took place previously, the week before, or a number of days before. The thing that seems to stand out, however, is the stark contrast between the Jewish leaders who wanted to kill Jesus compared with this woman who had a deep sacrificial love for Jesus. There's a contrast that's here, isn't there? And although this scene is out of chronological order, well, it does seem to fit perfectly in this final section of Mark's Gospel, because the focus at this point is really preparing for the death of Jesus. And so let's look to see what's actually happening here. Look, notice in verse 3 there, it says Jesus and his disciples, they come to the home of Simon the leper. Now, Simon had obviously been healed, otherwise it's unlikely to think that a man with leprosy would be hosting a dinner party. I don't know how many people would want to come to that dinner party if he had a leper there that had leprosy all over his body. Obviously he had been healed, but he couldn't quite shake the name, Simon the leper. Anyway, we now get to, according to John chapter 12, verse 3, we know that the woman who comes to him is Mary. She's the sister of Martha and also the sister of the man called Lazarus. Which means that, according to Luke chapter 10, verse 39, well, Mary had always been very, very attentive when it came to receiving instruction from Jesus. She was the one who would sit at Jesus' feet as Jesus gave instruction. But it's also the same Mary who saw this Jesus raise her brother Lazarus from the dead. She was one of the ones who was crying just a moment of time before that. But she saw him be raised from the dead. So this Mary, no stranger to lingering there at Jesus' feet. And perhaps this is the reason why Mary seems to be so in tune with the impending death of Jesus. Even more so than the 12 disciples when you think about it. The alabaster flask. This was it was carved out of, it was a flask that held contents of some sort, normally quite precious contents. It was carved out of Egyptian marble. It had a long neck with a little opening so that only little drops could actually be poured out of it. Little drops at a time. We know that when we think about, the old tomato sauce kind of, barbecues this time of year and the tomato sauce, and parents hate those little ones where you take the whole lid off and it's just got a big opening and you just sort of tip, the child goes and grabs the tomato sauce bottle and they tip it on their sausage and like half the bottle comes out. We hate those tomato sauce bottles. The ones we like are the little ones where you turn around and it's controlled. You squeeze it a little bit and it comes out just nicely and in a controlled kind of way. And not to say that tomato sauce is costly, but the point is that in the same way, these alabaster flasks, they were holding something that was very precious. They had a very thin neck. It was very controlled when you pulled them out, because you didn't want the precious contents inside to be coming all out at once. It would be a waste. But notice in verse 3 that Mary is not content with just anointing Jesus with just a few drops there. But it says there in verse 3 that she actually breaks the flask so that this costly oil could be poured out upon the Son of God, not sparingly. From Mary's point of view, she had little concern for the cost of the perfume, nor does she seem to be worried about how other people might respond to her act of love. All she wants to do is love and worship Jesus. Instead, the aim for Mary is to express honour, is to express worship to Jesus, regardless of the cost, regardless of what consequence may come her way. In the parallel account, John chapter 12, verse 3, it says that Mary also poured this oil on Jesus' feet and rubbed his feet with her hair. Notice also in verse 5 that it says the cost of the perfume, 300 denarii, which to a lot of us might not mean a whole lot, but to give you an idea, a denarius was equal to a day's wage of a common worker. And so when we have 300 denarii, well, what this is telling us is about a year's wages, an average worker's wages, which means that this flask of perfume is no small amount. I mean, if you go by today's standards of what the average wage is, roughly, you'd be, in terms of New Zealand, you'd be looking at about $50,000. It's about a $50,000 flask of oil that Mary just has no second thought of just lavishly pouring it upon Jesus, anointing Jesus. But notice in verse 4 that Mary's great act of love, her great act of reverence, her great act that we see here, it's met with some very, very strong resistance and strong criticism. Isn't that interesting? Someone pouring out all that they have for the Lord, and then onlookers are resisting it and criticizing it. Well, if we cross-reference this with the same account, John chapter 12, verses 4 to 6, we're given details as to who does the criticizing and what is motivating the criticism. That's handy to know, isn't it? John chapter 12, verses 4 to 6, it says, but one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? This he said, not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box and used to take what was put in it. So that kind of gives a bit of context, right? Gives a bit of context as to why the criticism was coming, who it was coming from, and why it was coming in the first place. It wasn't pure motives. On the outside, it looked like pure motives. Like, well, look, Judas is just trying to help out the ministry here. Judas is just trying to think of the best for everyone here. But all along, that resistance was a problem with his heart. While Judas was full of bitterness and hatred towards Jesus, only wanting to get all that he could, while looking for an opportune time to betray Jesus, well, Mary, on the other hand, was motivated by gratitude. Mary was motivated by love for Jesus. Mary wanted to give to him all that she could. She was looking for any opportunity to try to demonstrate this attitude of heartfelt worship. Notice carefully from the passage that Jesus accepts Mary's worship. He doesn't push it away. He accepts it. He doesn't limit her enthusiasm, nor does he limit the costly devotion to him. He receives it. In fact, notice in verse 6 that Jesus steps in to both defend Mary and also to commend Mary's actions. When a person is giving out something from themselves, when they're giving something of themselves which is very personally costly to him, well, Jesus receives that. Jesus is saying, don't you come down on that person, but he accepted it and he commended it. Now in verse 7, where Jesus says, you will have the poor always, let's make sure we're thinking about this correctly here. Jesus is not saying, hey, I just want to discourage people from assisting the poor. We don't want to get that. We don't want to kind of get from what Jesus is saying, well, that's great, we don't have to give to charity anymore. Jesus said it, so that's my out. You don't have to be, charitable when it comes to those people in need. He's not saying that. But instead, the point that Jesus is wanting to get across here is that his remaining time with his disciples, it was becoming increasingly short. And so there is a priority of the disciples at that point. The priority of the disciples at that point, because their time frame of Jesus was becoming increasingly short, well, the priority should have been doing exactly what it is that Mary was doing. They should have been worshipping at Jesus' feet. While it is loving, while it is noble to help the poor as we can, well, it was less than a week before Jesus would be crucified. The poor would still be there after Jesus would be crucified, but Jesus would be gone. In fact, notice in verse 8 that Jesus points to his impending death once again. He says, look, Mary pouring this oil on me is like she's preparing me for burial. He knew it was ahead of him. He knew no one would take his life from him. He would willingly and voluntarily lay it down himself. And she's saying, this is the time, this is the appointed time, and what Mary is doing to me right now is she's preparing me for this particular time. She is preparing me for my burial. He knew exactly what was going on. And of course, Jesus' words in verse 9, if you notice there, haven't they come true? Haven't they come true when Jesus says, hey, look, what Mary has done here will be remembered every time this gospel is spoken of or preached. Mary will be remembered. I mean, over 2,000 years have passed since that time, and here we are today talking about this Mary's sacrificial worship that's motivated by a heart of love for Jesus. Mary sacrificially honoured Jesus, and Jesus sovereignly made sure that her service to him was not in vain. Makes me think of Paul's closing words in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, is where he says, therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labour is not in vain in the Lord. I mean, what an encouraging truth that is for us to consider. If we're pouring out our lives, if we're pouring out our lives even at a great personal cost to ourselves, even in the face of criticism, even in the face of opposition, rest assured that your labour in the Lord is not in vain. I mean, I bet Mary couldn't have fathomed the thought that 2,000 years later, her simple sacrificial act would still be talked about. That we'd still be talking about it here, right before, the beginning of 2020. Would you could have even fathomed that it would have gone that far? And in a similar way, let us not underestimate what God can do with even the most simple of sacrificial acts of devotion to Him. Even if we may never ever get to see it within our lifetime. God can see to it that whatever it is that we have to offer Him, that it can be sovereignly used in ways beyond our wildest dreams, beyond our wildest imagination. And this is exactly what we're seeing here in the text. All Mary knew is that the King was before her, the Lord was before her, and she was going to pour out her life regardless of the cost. And God saw to it that her labour was not in vain, but it is still remembered even to this day, and the same is true for us as well. And that's why Paul says, beloved, be steadfast and immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labour in the Lord is not in vain. Well, moving on from the friends, verses 3 to 9, we come next to the false disciple. And this is in verses 10 to 11. So let's give our attention now to verses 10 to 11. After the situation with the friends, it says in verse 10, then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad, and they promised to give him money, so he sought how he might conveniently betray him. So here's another contrast for us. In contrast to Mary, who is remembered right throughout history for her sacrificial devotion to Jesus, Judas Iscariot is remembered right throughout history for his short-sighted betrayal of Jesus. I mean, think about it. Think about the unique privilege that Judas had to spend about 3 years in the very presence of Jesus. Think about the privilege that Judas had in receiving first-hand instruction from Jesus. Think about the privilege that he had in witnessing the example of Jesus. Think about the privilege that he had to receive so much love from Jesus. Think of all that Jesus bestowed upon this person, and what did Judas do with that? What did he do with the privilege that was given to him? Well, he squandered it away. What's interesting is that looking from the outside, Judas appeared to be a follower of Christ, didn't he? From the outside he did. But inwardly, he was motivated by selfishness. He was motivated by greed. He's only sticking with the other followers of Christ of what he could get out of the deal. What's interesting is that Judas's outward act was so convincing. It was so convincing that none of the other disciples ever expected that Judas would be the one who was the hypocrite. None of them ever suspected that he would be the traitor. But although none of the other disciples could see it coming, Jesus knew his heart. You see, we might be able to fool everyone else around us, but we can't fool Jesus. Jesus always knows where our hearts are really at. Yet I wonder how often Judas kind of thought to himself, hey, my true motives, they're flying under Jesus' radar. After all, Jesus loved Judas the same as he loved the other disciples. Jesus provided for Judas the same way that he provided for the other disciples. He cared for Judas the same way as he did the other disciples. He prayed for him, which is a reminder to us that we should never mistake God's common grace in our lives as approval for how we are living if we are not walking right before Him. I'll say that again. We should never mistake God's common grace in our lives as approval for how it is that we are living if we are not walking right before Him. Something we have to understand about God is that God is very, very kind. God is very, very long-suffering. But we shouldn't ever mistake that as though God doesn't really care about how it is that we're living. To illustrate this, think back to God's relationship to the people of Israel back in the Old Testament. In particular, think about the northern kingdom of Israel. Throughout their entire history of the northern kingdom of Israel, there was not a single king who put an end to the idolatry within their land. Instead, the people worshipped false gods, and they did so for a period of about 250 years. Now, over the 250-year period, God most certainly warned His people. He sent prophets to go and speak His word into their situation. And while this was happening, people still received the common graces from God. They received food, they had shelter, there was the giving of marriage, there was family, there was protection, there was security within their land. But there came a point when God's long-suffering came to an end. And like that, their land, the people's land, was invaded. They were taken captive, never to return to their land again. And so again, we should never mistake God's common grace in our lives for approval of how we are living, unless if we are not walking right before the Lord. This is a truth that Judas, overlooked, terribly overlooked. As for the chief priests, well, what would they have thought when he comes in? They thought, yes! They thought they hit the jackpot. This is great. We now have a snitch. We now have a mole. We now have an inside informant. This meant that they now had an opportunity to seize Jesus whenever the right opportunity presented itself. But how devastating to think that the Messiah's betrayer would come from among the 12. See, sometimes those who are closest to us can actually cause us the most harm. And as hard as this is to comprehend, well, we have to understand that God is still in complete control. How do we know this? Well, in the case of Jesus and Judas here, well, the details of Judas' betrayal, we know that it was all in God's control. Even those who are closest to us, who can sometimes hurt us the most, we know it was in God's control because details of Judas' betrayal, they were given by the prophets hundreds of years before they even came to pass. God knew exactly, again, the sovereignty of God, even in this passage here. He knew what was taking place. To everyone else, they would be freaking out. They'd be thinking, gosh, what is happening here? How can someone so close turn their back so viciously against the Son of God? Not out of God's control. For instance, in Psalm 41, verse 9, the psalmist foretells that the betrayer would be someone who was close, someone who was familiar. It says in Psalm 41:9, even my own familiar friend, in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. Of course, it reminds us of that scene of the Last Supper where Jesus and Judas go and they dip their bread in at the exact same time. And of course, in Zechariah chapter 11, verse 12, first of all, it's foretold that the price that Judas would be paid for this betrayal would be 30 pieces of silver. It says, then I said to them, if it is agreeable to you, give me my wages, and if not, refrain. So they weighed out for my wages 30 pieces of silver. And how many pieces of silver did he receive, as we see in the Gospel accounts? 30. Then in the very next verse, Zechariah 11, verse 13, it foretells of when Judas would later become overcome with guilt. He'd throw those 30 pieces of silver back to the chief priest, and the chief priest would take that and buy a potter's field with that money, which happened to be the very place where Judas hung himself. It says in Zechariah 11, verse 13, and the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, that princely price they set on me, So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord for the potter. And sure enough, it happened exactly the way that God foretold it would. Again, although Judas' betrayal of Jesus was horrific, which is unimaginable to even think of, even this, was still not outside the sovereignty of God. Friends, what this is reminding us of, again, is that there is no surprises for God. There is nothing throughout the course of human history that God goes, wow, I didn't see that coming. There are no curveballs for God. God is never caught off guard by what takes place. Well, we move on now from the false disciple, verses 10 to 11. Finally, we now come to the followers, verses 12 to 16. And what we're really going to see here is that these are preparations now for the Passover meal. Beginning in verse 12, if you look in your Bibles. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?" And he sent out 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him. Wherever he goes in, say to the master of the house, 'The teacher says, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' Then he will show you a large upper room, furnished and prepared. There make ready for us." So the disciples went out, came into the city, and found it just as he said to them, and they prepared the Passover. Now, in our study next week, next time in Mark's Gospel, we're going to be looking more closely at this final Passover meal. But in this part of today's passage, what we're given here are details about the preparations of that Passover meal leading up to that point. From verse 12, the storyline has moved to a Thursday now. So we're kind of jumping all over the place here, aren't we? We were at one point, and now Mark took us back to another point, and we're back in Bethany, and then we're back again, and now we've moved forward to Thursday on Jesus' Passion Week, which is the day of the annual Passover meal and its celebration. So it's no surprise, in verse 12, the disciples asked Jesus, where are we going to have it? Where's the Passover meal going to happen? Notice, though, Jesus' response in verse 13, he really keeps his cards close to his chest, doesn't he? He doesn't really give out a whole lot there in verse 13. In other words, he's not really giving away specific details, not when and where. And there's a good reason for this, I believe. Remember that Judas is now waiting for the opportune time, isn't he? Judas is there waiting for any time that he can try to disclose the location of Jesus to the religious leaders. And so at this point, if Jesus just openly announced where the location was as to where they would be eating the Passover meal, it's quite possible that Judas would have passed that information on to the religious leaders. After all, it'd be kind of nice and convenient in a nice room, enclosed, away from public eye, to go and arrest Jesus. Who knows? If he had done that, maybe they would have come in and arrested him even before the Lord's Supper was first instituted. Where would we be now? And so, this is the likely reason for why Jesus' instruction to these 2 men is so vague. These 2 men, if we cross-reference it with Luke's Gospel, it's Peter and John. He says Peter and John to make the preparations. And this is probably the likely reason for why he's so vague, a bit mystical as to what the details are. He didn't just say, hey, go down and find Bob and, go down to the local, room above the tavern down there. He didn't give names. There's nothing specific. There's no mentions of locations, no names. And so Judas wouldn't have had the advantage of knowing where it is that they would be meeting together for the Passover. Again, can't we see the sovereignty of God in this? I mean, everything leading up to the cross was happening exactly according to God's timetable. Nothing would interrupt, nothing would interfere with that. Even to the point where Jesus somehow gets a chance to pre-arrange a place, pre-arrange somewhere where they could celebrate the Passover meal so that he could keep things vague in front of Judas, his betrayer. Well, what was involved in the preparations for the Passover? What did Peter and John actually go to do when they would be sent out? Well, they would have taken a lamb. And that lamb they would have taken to the temple to be sacrificed. And then they would have taken part of that lamb back to eat with the meal, the Passover meal. It would have involved obtaining a number of different ingredients that were required for the feast, things like bread, wine, bitter herbs. And as we're going to see in our next study, this final Passover meal wouldn't be just a normal Passover meal. Because it's in this final Passover meal that Jesus is going to transform the Passover celebration into the Lord's Supper. Something that would commemorate the cross until he comes again. As the lambs were being slaughtered on that particular Passover, for that particular Passover meal, there we have it. Jesus, the Son, the Lamb of God, was there, willingly and voluntarily there, willing to give up his life as the ultimate Passover lamb. Isn't it interesting timing? Right to the very moment. As there, the nation is slaughtering lambs to have this commemoration of God's faithfulness in the past. Well, the very Lamb of God is right there in their very presence, saying, "Here I am, willing and voluntarily giving up my life to be that ultimate Passover lamb that won't be." We're not talking about something that's taken place in the past, but something that is going to give you deliverance for the future. More about that in our next study in the Gospel of Mark, but I think now we kind of want to bring what it is that we've seen in today's passage, and we want to kind of bring it to the Lord in prayer. And we want to bring it to the Lord in prayer and really ask God to help apply the truths that we've actually seen in the passage. There's been a lot that's here. The main theme is the preparations or the participants of the leading up to the crucifixion of Jesus. And we've seen these various people who have been involved in that. But again, the underlying thread, the sovereign, the thread right throughout the whole thing is the sovereignty of God bringing about all that is about to take place. So let's just pray, and we'll ask that God will apply these truths to our hearts this morning. Let's pray. Father, we thank you so much for your kindness to us this morning. You're so kind to us that as your word has been taught, as your word has been preached, you've both revealed and reminded to us specific truths about who you are. You've revealed and reminded us about your purposes for mankind. And Lord, we are comforted by the fact that you are sovereign. And so, Lord, as we think about the challenges that we are facing right now, as we think about the difficulties that we are facing, as we're thinking about the opposition that's coming our way, as we think about the disappointments that are in our lives, as we think about the dead ends that we've probably hit, and some of us have perhaps hit, as we think about resistance to what it is that we're doing coming our way, Lord, help us to be encouraged and help us to be comforted by the fact that you are sovereign over all things. Help us to be encouraged and comforted that you have a plan and a purpose behind everything which takes place in our lives as your people, as your children. Help to remind us that we are never alone, that you're always with us, even when the road in front of us seems lonely at times. Help to remind us that there is nothing that is out of your control. Although things may feel as if they're out of control for us, Lord, we realize that nothing is ever out of control for you. So God, help us to rest in this truth. Lord, help us to recognize that your sovereign plans don't always mean that things are going to be easy for our lives. We only need to think about your sovereignty in light of the cross of Jesus and the difficulty that was but for a moment. But at the same time, we rest in the fact that on the other side of the challenges, on the other side of the difficulties that you allow us to go through, we realize that there is a glorious future which awaits us. And so, God, we thank you for that. Thank you that you are in control. Help us, whatever situation that we're going through right now, whatever the burden is for us right now, help us to really weigh in on your sovereignty and help us to walk in confidence and faith in light of it. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we're just going to have